From the studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali. It's Friday, July 24th, 2015. Sandra Bland's death is ruled a suicide by Texas authorities after her autopsy was released. We'll turn to journalist Thandisizwe Chimurenga to explore the ongoing controversy over Bland's police custody death. And leading leftist Indian politician Brinda Karat analyzes Prime Minister Narendra Modi's first year in office and how the leader of the world's largest democracy is living up to his ambitious campaign promises. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Cristina Mislan. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. Hi, Cristina.
Hello, Sonali.
A middle-aged white man named John Russell Hauser from Alabama is suspected to have shot and killed two people in a movie theater in Lafayette, Louisiana. The shooting took place late last evening during a film screening. Mr. Hauser apparently began shooting at the two people in front of him and fired a total of 13 shots randomly into the theater. The two victims were 21-year-old Macy Bro and 33-year-old Jillian Johnson. 9 others were injured. When Hauser attempted to escape, police officers were closing in on him and he shot himself. Meanwhile, hours before the shooting, President Obama, who's currently in Britain, gave an interview to the BBC's John Sopel, during which he said that his failure to pass gun control laws in the U.S. was one of his biggest regrets. Well, Cristina, another shooting by another white man, which the NRA will attempt to, of course, paint as a bad apple, and which has nothing to do in their mind with reducing the number of guns in the U.S. What are your thoughts on this shooting?
Yeah, so let's look at a couple of numbers. In just 2014, there were about 32,000 deaths due to gun violence. That makes about 88 deaths per day. And the numbers vary just a little bit, but not by much. And so it really stands to question, President Obama should be worried and concerned. The U.S. government spends much of its time and money on securing the nation, as they would say, from so-called global terrorism. But what actually is having a bigger impact on Americans is state terrorism from the U.S. itself. And so that includes the inability to pass gun regulation on the government's part, but also, the other racially motivated murders that we have been confronting for some years now that are also often due to gun violence. And so what we're facing is this homegrown terrorism that is largely influenced by an elite group of people who run the country. And I see these these random white men as very much a part of this larger structural issue that we have. And the NRA is very much a part of that elite group, along with the militarized state police and politicians.
For the first time since the U.S. began its bombing campaign on Syria, aimed mostly at the Islamic State, Turkey joined the fight today. Turkish warplanes targeted 3 areas in Syria this morning that it says were ISIS locations. The bombing campaign was apparently prompted by intelligence that ISIS was planning to target Turkey. At the same time, authorities arrested hundreds of people inside Turkey that it says are suspected militants. One Turkish soldier, Mehmet Yalcin Nain, was killed by ISIS fighters. His funeral was attended by grieving family members and has further hardened Turkish resolve. Turkey had been a reluctant member of the U.S.-led coalition against ISIS until now. Cristina, could this signal a dangerous widening of an already chaotic and violent regional war?
Well, I think it's safe to say that anytime the U.S. is stepping up its military intervention, there will most likely be a more chaotic and violent outcome, and particularly since the U.S. is now using bases in Turkey. Yes, that means more violence will come. And so I think, as some voices have suggested, what we're seeing is this heightened global war that reaches beyond just a few countries. It's no longer just in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so more violence against ISIS will not make ISIS go away, right? History has shown us, especially anytime U.S. foreign policy is involved, is that the so-called enemy will always be replaced with another enemy. And so what we've seen in the past as well is that the U.S. will act in haste over perceived threats of national security, which, by the way, doesn't seem to be the case with ISIS. and that never ends well. So unfortunately, what we'll be witnessing is how much destruction will come in the years ahead.
And finally, the GOP-dominated House of Representatives yesterday passed a bill that bans states from passing labeling laws identifying genetically modified foods. The bill, called the Safe and Accurate Food Labeling Act, allows companies to voluntarily disclose whether their foods are GMO-free after passing a certification process overseen by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. 3 states, Vermont, Maine, and Connecticut, have already passed laws requiring labeling. The House bill, if it becomes law, would prevent those state laws from being implemented. A recent survey found that 90% of Americans support labeling. Democratic Representative John Conyers, writing in an op-ed on CNN.com, denounced the bill. He called it, quote, a serious attack on transparency that presents a dubious one-size-fits-all approach to federal policymaking. Most importantly, it presents a potentially serious threat to our long-term health. Cristina, isn't it amazing that the GOP is all for states' rights, but only when it suits them?
Yes, I mean, on the surface, it's very ironic that, as you just said, Republicans, who do often argue for less big government, right, and so more state rights, have passed a bill that represents the exact opposite. But what it is really is just a prime example of what politicians actually do in this country, which is dictated to them by what corporate lobbyists want them to do. And so it's actually the corporations that really run the country. And even if we analyze the justifications for passing this bill, right, it doesn't add up. So evidence has shown that food prices have not gone up as Republicans have suggested. And also, we're actually seeing polls that Americans do want to know what is in their food. And the Republicans would like to pretend that the American public doesn't know much. But that just isn't the case. We know exactly what we need. And what we need is a government that would act in our interest and not Washington.
Cristina, always an honor to have you on our program. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thank you.
Cristina Mislan is our daily Newsflash guest expert. She's an assistant professor of journalism studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali. The police custody death of Sandra Bland has gripped the nation, coming to symbolize so much of what is broken about our system of policing. The 28-year-old African-American woman was found dead in her jail cell 3 days after she was first arrested, after being pulled over by Texas State Trooper Brian Encinier and violently arrested. Now, an autopsy released by Texas authorities has concluded that, quote, the cause of death was hanging, and the manner of death was a suicide. Family and friends have ruled out suicide, saying they didn't believe the woman they knew and loved, who had just gotten a new job that she was moving to Texas for, would have killed herself. The Texas prosecutor also said that Bland had marijuana in her system. She was active on social media and a vocal supporter of the Black Lives Matter movement. She regularly posted commentaries called #SandySpeaks. Bland was laid to rest on Tuesday night. Joining me today is Thandisizwe Chimurenga. She's a contributing writer for Truth Out, Counterpunch, and the Los Angeles Watts Times and Sentinel newspapers, author of the newly released Reparations Not Yet, A Case for Reparations and Why We Must Wait. Her earlier book was No Doubt, The Murders of Oscar Grant. Let's first talk about the autopsy results, Thandi. So let's talk about the fact that Texas authorities have ruled her death as a suicide. They basically said that she had cut marks on her left wrist, which were in a state of healing. And the Texas prosecutor who shared the results said that there were no bite marks or other injuries on her face or lips or tongue, which would be consistent with a violent struggle. Do you believe this?
Of course, I don't believe that, Sonali. You know, Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC had the mother and the sister and the attorney for the family of Sandra Bland on, and they talked about the text message that they received from the Waller County DA stating that a second autopsy was needed because the first one was defective. Later on in the show, they talked about the exact wording of the of the text, stating that they were hoping that the body would be available for future investigations. And now we're seeing all of this media mentions, press releases coming out stating that the that the coroner in Texas has ruled it a suicide. It's got to be the fastest autopsy and results ever known to humanity, first of all. But I'm with the family. We believe that foul play is caused her death. But even if it did not, even if the actual hands of those police officials were not around Sandra Bland's neck, even if she did take her own life, they created the conditions for that. It was a totally fraudulent, unnecessary arrest. She should have been under visual supervision. They have blood on their hands regardless of the situation.
I'm really glad you brought up this point because, you know, it's certainly those who do attempt to take their lives and sometimes do succeed in taking their lives. It's really difficult to necessarily be able to predict what will cause somebody to do that. If she died in police custody, regardless of the manner of her death, if she did indeed take her life, isn't that still police responsibility? They were supposed to check on her once every hour, and now records are showing that 2 hours went by and she was not checked on.
When you're in custody, you are the property, quote unquote. Mm-hmm. That's a horrible word for Black folk. You're a property of the state. You are the ward of the state. You're in their care and custody. You are their responsibility. So of course they should have been responsible, especially if it's so much in this case that we cannot believe. But let's say, for example, the intake documents where she had talked about suicide in the past, even though she was not feeling suicidal at that moment, according to those documents, someone should have been watching her. They were negligent.
And there was a friend of Sandra Bland's who shared a voicemail that she left for him with the media. I want to play for you and our audience a clip of that friend of Bland's sharing this cell phone voicemail.
See, the judge, I don't really know. They got me set at a $5,000 bond. I'm still just at a loss for words, honestly, about this whole process. How they're switching lanes with no signal, turning to all of this, I don't even know. But I'm still here, so I just come back when you can.
And that is the voice of Sandra Bland while she was jailed, saying she was still here, that she just couldn't understand what was going on. And $5,000 bond for either failing to use a signal when the police essentially prompted her to move out of his way, or failing to put out her cigarette when he asked her to, which of course she had the right to keep her cigarette lit. I mean, under what circumstances is such not just an arrest and jailing and the violent way in which she was handled, but also this $5,000 bond? Under what circumstances could this be justified?
Well, the $5,000 bond is for the assault on a police officer. During the police officer's assault of Sandra Bland, she asked 14 times, why am I under arrest? What am I being charged with? It was never stated. But once wind of this gets out and the media and people begin to ask questions, the sheriff's department or the police, they respond and say that she assaulted a police officer. So that's why it was $5,000 bond. But again, that particular police officer, Brian Encina, was removed from active duty based upon what his superiors saw on the dash cam video, that he was totally out of compliance and out of line. So once again, police have created a situation where a person ended up dying. They assaulted her. He had no business pulling over. If you notice, he was coming behind her for a reason. And then she got out of the way and he decided to cite her for failure to use the turn signal. So why did he turn his car around? Why was he pursuing her anyway?
I'm really glad you brought up the fact that essentially Sandra Bland seems to have simply been pulled over because the cop felt like it, and then he was able to create a situation where he created an excuse to arrest her, and he said, "I will light you up." That was a threat.
If you saw the video, he was about to hand her the ticket. It should have been over at that point. He asked her to put out the cigarette. Why? If she's going to take the form and sign it, wouldn't she have to remove the cigarette to take the pen anyway? He was looking for an excuse. He was baiting her.
And he didn't even say, "Please put out the cigarette," or "I'm ordering you to put out the cigarette. He actually said, "Do you mind putting out the cigarette?" And she said, "No."
She minded putting out the cigarette. See, this is what I'm talking about. White supremacy never, ever takes responsibility for its actions. It can do no wrong. It has the right to do whatever it wants. And once you question it, it begins to blame the victim. Well, if Sandra had just kept her mouth shut, if she had just put out the cigarette, if she had just taken the ticket and fought it later, how come that cop was allowed to act that way? And if you notice, everything had been on the dash cam except when he takes her out of the car. He moves it out of the line of sight. Why didn't he have her directly on the hood so that he could place her under arrest or handcuff her? Why was he taking her out of the line of sight? These are the kinds of questions that we need to continue to ask. This is the type of thing that we need to continue to hammer at. Police have got to get the message that no, you cannot do whatever it is you want to do. You will be questioned on it. You will be confronted about it.
Thandi, let's talk about the fact that the character assassination of Sandra Bland has already, of course, begun after her death. You've written about this before, the case of Oscar Grant, where after a person gets killed by police, or in this case within police custody, to try to be accurate, or as accurate as we can be given the information we have. Now, of course, we're being told she had marijuana in her system, a large amount of marijuana in her system. Of course, we saw her interactions with the police. Even if she had had some marijuana, she did not sound inebriated. She sounded rightfully angry. And of course, if she was in Colorado or some of the states where it's legal, that wouldn't even be an issue. And of course, if she was a white person who had smoked pot, nobody would ever bring it up, right? So do you see this as part of that sort of character assassination? The seconded murder?
The murders of Oscar Grant, the murders of Sandra Bland, the murders of Eric Garner, the murders of Tamir Rice. There's always a double, triple, sometimes a quadruple murder that takes place. The character assassination is to place in the minds of the populace the rationale. It's okay, well, the person did something wrong. If they hadn't done something wrong or hadn't been doing something illegal, again, we never, ever question the police. And this is one of the best cases I've ever seen where there have been so many horrible inconsistencies. We can no longer continue to give police the benefit of the doubt. The lawyer for the family says that the district attorney sends him a text. Sandra either swallowed or smoked a large amount of marijuana in custody.
In custody, not before she was arrested, but while she was in custody?
This type of wording, who smokes marijuana in jail? If you're allowed to smoke marijuana in jail, that means you're probably going to pass it to the guards, okay?
Wow.
I mean, it's ridiculous the levels that they go to assassinate the character, to kill the person a second time. They go to such ridiculous lengths that they end up insulting themselves in the process.
And then, of course, there's the media assassination. The CNN put on an ex-cop who said Sandra Bland sounded arrogant from the very beginning. And of course, you've seen this before as well, right?
Well, of course, that's the crime. Yeah. That's the crime. Contempt of cop, being arrogant. That's the reason, really, why. Because under white supremacy, Black people are not allowed any shred of dignity. They're not allowed bodily integrity. What people have got to understand, Black people in the United States of America, I haven't lived anyplace else, so I can't talk about any place else. But in the United States of America, Black people are the only people who give their children, quote unquote, the talk. Black folks know what that means, the talk.
Yeah.
Charles Blow in the New York Times talked about the talk. We are the only people that sit our children down and say, this is how you conduct yourselves around law enforcement. Nobody else has to do that. Nobody else does that. And what we have got to begin to understand, Black people and others, is that there's going to come a time, we're seeing it now, where a Black person is going to be like, you know what? I'm not having it today. I'm going to assert my rights. I have the right to dignity. What you are doing is wrong. What you are doing is illegal, and I'm not going to take it. It is unfortunate that that might end in death. But there's going to come a time where people are going to be like, you know what, I'm not taking it anymore. And we're not talking about rising up. I'm not talking about rising up in an uprising. I'm talking about a simple traffic stop. Yeah. No, I'm not going to sign this. I'm not going to get out the car. Basically the same thing that Sandra Bland said. I'm not going to have it today. And that is a person's right. Of course we mourn. Of course we're angry. Of course it's not right. But it is that person's right to demand one last bit of shred of dignity, even if it's that person's last day on earth. People are just going to get fed up.
Speaking of dignity, Sandra Bland's mother, who she was very, very close to, they went on a road trip very, just a short while before Bland died. Her name Geneva Veal, again, another mother who's lost her child. And at the funeral, she spoke saying, "There is not anywhere I could see that my baby took her own life." People. The memorial, that's right. I'm sorry, at the memorial.
On the 25th.
And she said, "My purpose is to go back to Texas and stop all of the injustices in the South. Once I put this baby in the ground, I'm ready. This means war." And of course, people never want to see the deaths of their loved ones be in vain. How important are Geneva Veal's words and her anger?
It's important and it's refreshing. Yeah. She's not talking about forgiving those who are responsible for the murder of her child. She's talking about taking on a system that created those conditions. And that's what's needed. We need for family members to become organized and confront these systems. There are a lot of high-profile families, family members of people who have been murdered. And, I'm not trying to speak ill of them at all. They suffered a horrendous loss that I would never, ever want to suffer. I don't know if I could recover from it. But many times they set up foundations in the name of their children's name, but it does nothing to deal with that entity that caused them to lose their child in the first place. And that is what needs to be attacked. That is what needs to be confronted so that other parents won't lose their children. You have to confront the systems, the reason why your child is no longer here. And in many instances, it is the police or some variant of the criminal justice system. And so we welcome her words and we welcome her addition to this fight.
And a quick correction, the memorial service was what happened earlier this week. Sandra Bland's funeral is scheduled for Saturday. And I understand that the family is demanding a second independent autopsy, which is also quite important, right?
Oh, definitely. Because again, there are just so many inconsistencies and so many instances of outright incompetence in Texas. You have to have some fresh, objective eyes looking at this issue.
Let's talk about cases of other Black women's deaths around the very same time that Sandra Bland died while she was in jail was the death of Kendra Chapman, an 18-year-old girl. I mean, just 18, not even, woman yet. Very similarly to Bland, died in police custody. We were told that she killed herself in Alabama. She was accused of stealing a cell phone. Her case hasn't gotten nearly as much attention. And I'm wondering, the fact that it's a thing that apparently African-American women are committing suicide while being jailed, the fact that that's even a trend is just not right.
I don't know if African-American women are committing suicide.
Quote unquote committing suicide.
I think they're being murdered. And I think that that's something that has happened all along, but it does not get the same attention as men, number one, because it's not as blatant and in your face. We saw Eric Garner being choked to death. Yeah. We saw Tamir Rice being killed within 2 seconds of a police officer coming on the scene. We don't have video evidence of Sandra being choked, of Kendra being choked, or of hanging herself. And so the violence that happens against women is usually in a dark corner. It's away from public eyes. And so the public, the media and those people who are responsible for these types of murders are able to put out that kernel of doubt in our minds. Well, maybe she did kill herself. We don't have any video evidence to state otherwise. And so because that type of violence against Black women is usually away from public eyes, it's not as visceral. It's visceral hearing Eric Garner say, "I can't breathe." Yeah. It's visceral seeing Michael, I've forgotten his name, the guy in North Charleston. It's visceral seeing him coolly, calmly take out his gun and shoot at Walter Scott 8 times as Walter Scott runs away. That's very, very visceral. What we have with Sandra, what we have with Kendra is the body after the fact. And so that's one of the reasons why you don't see so much of a reaction. There's still anger. And as we can see with the organizing that's going on, it begins to build. But at the moment it happens, it's not the same for Black men because it's not as visual to us. Yeah. It's not as visceral.
Yet Sandra Bland's case has become so important and powerful. And I'm wondering, Thandi, if that is because of her, after her death, her humanity continued to exist on social media with the multiple sort of footprints that she left behind with her videos. People were able to get to know Sandra Bland in the little bits that she left, the videotaped commentaries that she left. She became a three-dimensional human being who spoke out, who laughed, who was full of life. She had a gleam in her eye and a big smile on her face. And I'm wondering if that is part of what has really generated a widespread public anger beyond the African-American community right now.
Oh, definitely. When people see those videos of her and get that indication of how she was, they think it's very, very unlikely that she committed suicide. They look at, again, these inconsistencies coming out of Texas and the state of law enforcement across the country, and they know that law enforcement cannot be trusted and that the officials in Texas are probably lying through their teeth. But also, we're in a different place now here in July of 2015 than we were in July of 2014. We were still asking, why aren't you rallying around women being murdered in police custody by law enforcement? We're still asking that question. We're still telling people to say her name, but so many different events to raise that awareness and that criticism have taken place by July of 2015. I think that also is a reason why it has created so much outrage.
Finally, Thandi, you've been following the case of the death of Alisha Thomas in Southern California, and the sentence was just handed down for the police officer in that case, a 3-year sentence, I believe. LAPD officer Mary O'Callaghan. Is this a victory? 3 years for killing a woman?
You understand that the sentence the last 20 months of the sentence were suspended. And in California, for every day that you spend in jail, you get 1 day credit. So even though she was immediately taken into custody when she was found guilty a few months ago, 49 days ago, she's got a credit of 98 days already. So this is another officer who has the blood on their hands of a person unnecessarily, who's probably going to spend a year or less in a county jail, not a state prison. So on the one hand, we're seeing a conviction for the death of a person. In a way, that's a victory. It's not the charge it should have been. It's not the amount of time it should have been. If, say, for example, I had killed a police officer.
Right.
So, 6 of one, half dozen of the other.
Thandi, thank you so much for the work that you do and for joining us today and reflecting on these issues.
Thank you so much for having me.
My guest is Thandisizwe Chimurenga. She's a contributing writer for Truth Out, Counterpunch in the Los Angeles Watts Times and the Sentinel newspapers. She's also the author of the newly released Reparations Not Yet, A Case for Reparations and Why We Must Wait. Her earlier book was No Doubt The Murders of Oscar Grant, and we've been talking about Sandra Bland as well as Alisha Thomas, Kendra Chapman, and many, many others. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. It has been just over a year since the new Prime Minister of the world's largest democracy has been in office, Mr. Narendra Modi, who has courted controversy over his connections to the 2002 anti-Muslim pogrom in Gujarat, and who's famous for his selfies and clumsy comments, has yet to achieve many of his campaign promises. During his first year in office, he has pushed land reform bills that opponents say target farmers and indigenous communities. During a visit to Europe earlier this year, Modi declared India is open for business. I recently spoke with Brinda Karat about the first year in office of Mr. Modi, assessing his first year. She is a leading Indian politician with the Communist Party of India, Marxist. She was the General Secretary of the All India Democratic Women's Association from 1993 to 2004. She continues today as its Vice President, and she served as a Member of Parliament in 2005. She also became the first woman member of her party's top governing council, the Politburo. She's the author of Survival and Emancipation: Notes from Indian Women's Struggles. In the past couple of years, India has been in the international spotlight for a series of very high-profile rapes and sexual assaults. Not to say that wasn't happening before, but certain incidents got a lot of attention, and many Indians saw it as a sort of stain on India. And there's, I understand, just been this kind of internal struggle, but also a lot of dialogue. How, as a feminist, do you assess the national dialogue on gender, on feminism, and on sexual assault in the past couple of years in India?
I don't think it's a dialogue which has a homogeneity. I think, there are different people with different approaches which are all coming into the dialogue. And I think one of the things that we do see is that the so-called women's issue has become a much more an issue which is also linked to basic rights of citizenship, of basic rights of democracy, a constitutional framework for the rights of women and the rights of women to security, rather than an individual aspect of, my security. Because if you look at it that way, then you always tend to go into a place where you're asked, so why were you there? Why were you walking in the street at night? Why were you with your boyfriend or with your partner, at a late night show, etc.? So I think the framework for the discussion, women's movements have pushed it into a more gender-friendly space. But at the same time, you have a politics ruling this country which really sees women seriously, in a very restricted, confined role, and which would like to blame the victim for everything that's happening to her. And despite being a woman, what are you doing there at night? This is the kind of approach, and it's serious. And I think more than the dialogue, it's also the dialogue in street actions. It's the mobilization of a much larger number of Indians, men and women, which came out after the terrible Nirbhaya case in December of 13, sorry. Yeah, so I think that is one of the aspects that, it's positive in the sense that people are fighting back. But, there doesn't really seem to be very much of an impact as far as the number of cases are concerned. In fact, we are seeing a very, very disturbing increase in the kind of violence. It's sexual assault, it's also domestic violence. And I think it is one of the greatest challenges that India faces.
And the Modi government, in speaking out, or in fact, even during the election campaign before the election of the BJP, made a lot of promises. I think, of course, riding this wave of frustration felt by the public. So what specifically did he promise? And I know it's only been a year, might be not enough time to deliver, but had he made specific promises, and has he even begun to deliver on them, on the issue of gender justice?
You see, the issue really is what you consider gender justice. If you don't consider giving women jobs and equal wages and labor protections as gender justice, what do you consider gender justice? So the issue really is so deeply linked with the whole ideological framework in which the Modi government is operating. Now, for example, as I was saying, look at just work days for women. They have gone down drastically in rural India. Now, how do you empower a poor rural woman unless you can ensure that she gets decent work and she gets a decent wage, she gets an equal wage? How can you ensure that unless you give a woman equal right to assets, for example, land, but you're taking away everybody's land for the corporates. So where does a woman fit in there? So the point really is that, and even if you just look at it from the angle of violence, we set up, we have something called the Nirbhaya Fund, which was set up after the victim of that terrible gang rape in Delhi. And there's a lot of money sitting in that fund, but there is not a single scheme. In fact, the Women and Child Minister for Women and Child Affairs in India has been complaining that she wants to set up crisis centers for rape survivors so that they can go to a place right away at the district level. But the Modi government has said, we don't have the money for it. But they have the money, they don't have the money for it. So they're saying, we're going to have it only at the state level. So, when you come to the nitty-gritty of it and look at the small detail, Modi talks big, but unfortunately, it's really not playing out on the ground.
So you mentioned land, and that's a big issue in India. It's an agricultural economy, but it's also a densely populated country, so land is premium. And Modi has promised land reforms. He has opened up, thrown out the welcome mat, ideologically at least, and metaphorically to the world, saying India is open for business. What are some of the land reforms that he has put forth? I understand you were at a meeting recently that was reported in the press where you said the parliament has turned into a gang of capitalists, or at least that's what was reported. So what are they doing with land reform in India?
Well, what I actually said was that Parliament is, now becoming a house of corporates and corporate representatives. And that is something really disturbing in Indian politics, because you are deciding laws for a country which still has the highest number of malnourished people in the world, which is what the most recent FAO report has said. We have and a lot of them are dependent on land. They are small farmers. Unless you have investment into the small farm economies in India, and unless you provide viable alternatives, if you want them to move out and to have, a better opportunities of employment, instead of which this is basically a land grab ordinance, which Modi is bringing in. And this land grab ordinance allows corporates to take over land, including fertile land, without the consent of farmers. Now, this is not making India easy for business. This is making India a hellhole for the largest number of people who are farmers. So our point is, yes, industrialization is important, but you cannot have industrialization on the graves of India's farmers. This is not 18th century and 19th century capitalism just running riot. This is a democracy. India, you claim India to be the most developing, fastest developing country. You show the growth rates, and yet you have, in the last 1 year, a 26% increase in farmer suicides because of distress. So these are things which it's not land reform, it's land grab.
And he has promised something that, sounds really fascinating and wonderful on paper, which is 100 new smart cities. Modi seems very taken by technology, and the cult of personality that's grown up around him has also been based a little bit on that. What are these smart cities that he's promising?
It's maximum propaganda and minimum performance, to tell you the truth. Nobody knows. What is he actually talking about, except giving real estate corporates a huge opportunity to grab land? What smart cities? Let's make Delhi a smart city. Delhi has the largest, most terrible slums. Delhi has a population which is highly undernourished. Let's make the city of Delhi, the capital of India, start with that. How can you have a smart city where you have this huge population of poor people? I mean, I think it would be smart if you started talking about socially relevant policies which would help people to make smart choices about their lives.
And so the bullet trains that he has promised won't ease poverty?
Really, what can I say about that? I mean, In fact, what's happening really is the Indian Railways has played historically, as you know, a very important role in, in helping development. But what's happening now is the Indian Railways is being privatized. For the first time, they're allowing private industry to come into Indian Railways. And we know what happened in Britain, for example. We know what's happened in many other countries where public transport has been replaced by privatization, which has led to... And railways is the one mode of transport for millions of people all across India who travel to their places of work. Now, if you're going to privatize the railways and if you're going to have bullet trains, which are going to be so expensive, who's going to ride in them? So the question really is the obscene inequalities in India. And for Modi, that is not the priority. So you have all these huge schemes in an ocean of increasing poverty and inequality. I don't think that's the way to take India forward.
What about the role of the main opposition party, which is a role that the Congress Party is now playing? The Congress Party, which has for years sort of been the main party in power in India, and it seems to be a convenient ploy right now to have the BJP against which the Congress can play the progressive party. Is that what's happening?
Absolutely. I don't know if anybody sees it as progressive, but certainly the positioning is there. I mean, frankly, it's quite a joke when, Mr. Rahul Gandhi starts saying that, you are suit boot sarkar. I mean, what was his sarkar for, since the 1990s? Suit boot meaning a suited, booted government, representing the corporates. But, I mean, Modi's policies, in fact, are really a takeover of the Congress policies, except that he can be much more aggressive because he has the numbers in Parliament and the Congress didn't. So that's the only difference, but there's not a jot of difference in their economic policies. So when you hear Mr. Rahul Gandhi speaking that kind of language, you think, well, I mean, forget it. In this day and age, all you need to have is two statements of what he's saying now and what he said 5 years ago.
I think that not just the Congress, but certainly now the BJP are playing to and have often played to India's educated middle class. When they talk, for example, about wanting to cut red tape and bureaucracy, which the middle class is very frustrated with because it's harder for them to get things done. When they talk about the Make It in India campaign, bringing manufacturing jobs to India and stuff, importing things from outside, it seems as though that plays well to the minority of Indians that are middle class and educated.
Well, I think manufacturing is critical, and I think Make in India, the way that Modi is positioning it is to do away with all labor laws, so as to make in India and make in India with basically, demeaned slave labor.
So turn India into China.
Well, China at least had some protection for its workers. But today, even the RBI governor has said that you cannot have Make in India on the basis of a world economy where your exports are coming down. So you manufacture in India and sell outside, but the world economy is not accepting that kind of model 20 or 30 years after it worked in China. So what the RBI governor has also suggested is expand the domestic market. But to expand the domestic market, you need to put government money in public infrastructure, in industry, so as to trigger off a manufacturing boost to provide employment. So if you have more money in people's hands in India, and you have a domestic economy which is much better than it is right now, where there's so much inequality, you will have Make in India, Made in India, Sell in India. You can't just have make, you have to have Sell in India because you have the largest population. For example, the latest consumption expenditure figures right now, it shows that there's a decline over the last year. So there's no demand. There's no demand because, you don't have money in your pocket. So I think manufacturing is important, industry is important, but the way that Mr. Modi thinks of bringing in FDI by, demeaning your own workers, having cheap labor as your biggest offering to world capital, it's not going to work.
I mean, Indian labor is already quite exploited.
Do you know, out of every 100 rupees of a cost of a factory, just 2 rupees 17 paisa is the cost, the wage cost. So it's so low already. So where do you want to push it down, So
So, what about the fact that the Indian left, of which your party, the CPIM, represents a strong part? What sort of role does the CPIM and other left parties play? And there was a time when there seemed as though there was more power in the hands of left parties, and that's sort of come and gone.
That's true. We have suffered a big electoral setback in the last 5 years, and even in the last Lok Sabha elections. So our numbers in parliament are down. So certainly that does affect your intervention as far as parliament is concerned, as far as preventing the kind of laws which Modi wants to push. 50 laws he wants to push without parliamentary scrutiny. And of course, if the left had a bigger presence in parliament, we would have been able to fight that in a much stronger way. However, I think that right now what India needs is a movement based on alternative politics. And I think that is where the CPIM and the left has to come out much more strongly in a more united way. Because, here you have, it's not really BJP versus Congress as far as economics is concerned, because they're both on the same side. So basically, to have an understanding of alternative politics, I think the fulcrum has to be united left. And I think that's what we're working on right now. Wider platform of left forces, of left and democratic-minded citizens, not necessarily in political parties, just individuals, groups, organizations, movements, and that kind of a coming together. Social alliances, I think, is very, very critical. And our recent party conference, our national party conference, has decided on this approach for our intervention. And I hope that that's going to help us to increase the resistance.
And how do you explain the electoral defeats? And also, does that have anything to do with the rise of a new party on the scene, the Aam Aadmi Party, which many have made much of? It's not clear necessarily whether they have an ideological platform beyond ending corruption, etc.
No, not at all. The AAP has just 4 members in parliament, and that also from a single state. So I don't think that's anything to do with it. It's more to do with the loss of our base in West Bengal. Because our representation parliament was mainly from the 3 states of Kerala, West Bengal, and Tripura. So while we have, maintained our position in Kerala, just with a few ups and downs, basically it is in West Bengal that we lost our electoral presence. And we have faced a setback there. But I think over the last year or two, the resistance in Bengal has grown. And I think, I hope, that with our own corrections of our own weaknesses and with, the kind of all-in unity that there was against, the most important left-run government in India, which was in Bengal. So there was a range of forces against us, and, that unity worked to isolate us from the people. And I think we are overcoming that at the grassroots level. And I'm confident that in the coming days and months and years, you will see a resurgence of the left in Bengal.
Is there an influencing of youth in ideologies such as communism, socialism? Is communism and socialism relevant to young Indians today?
I think there are young Indians and young Indians. So I think, we do find that a large communities of young people in rural India, among Adivasis, among scheduled castes, among the working class, are attracted to the left. But yes, it's a fact that, in the urban areas, the young, educated, university-going students, the kind of mobilizations that we saw in the 70s, 80s, are not there. And I think that is also very much to do with the monopolies in the media and the monopolies in communication today. This whole assault on reality following the collapse of the Soviet Union and socialism as a dead letter and so on, there's nothing but capitalism. That did have a very big impact worldwide, ideologically. But we do find, for example, in many areas in Europe, we see in Greece, we see in Portugal, we see in many areas in Europe and even in American campuses, we see a bigger interest in left ideology, in Marxism. Latin America, of course. I mean, Latin America has, led the resistance to neoliberal policies, and they have provided sustainable alternatives. But it has had an impact, and it is a struggle.
So when you were saying,
I don't want to underestimate, the setback that we've had ideologically worldwide. But, there's a logic to the fight back. Because look at where capitalism is landing the world today. I mean, does capitalism have any answers morally, ethically, economically, politically, except to give more and more power to the 1%? I mean, let's face it, it does not have the answers. Socialism does. But I think every country has to work out its own way of reaching that socialist goal.
so on the issue of the media, which is an interesting question, Indian media companies have just boomed in the last few years, but also multinational conglomerates have taken over much of the media landscape in India as well. And you see a very different landscape on television, for example, today than you did before. At the same time, the rise of internet media and social media and peer-to-peer communications has risen remarkably, where people are able to communicate with one another and with people around the world like never before. How do you see those sort of twin forces impacting the way people think and the future of the left in India?
Well, I believe that, there are certainly different tracks available today as far as communication is concerned. But I am really concerned that the net and the whole issue today of net neutrality really presages the intervention of corporates and big money into what was considered free media and free communication. So if you're not going to have free access to a media of your choice, even on internet, you're going to see the same patterns of corporate takeover of communication that you're seeing in the mainstream news channels. I mean, it is just shocking and sickening and disgusting that, the money that's put in, and, we have something called paid news, It's literally, I mean, of course, you have the more obvious parts of it where you're buying advertisement time and you're buying out journalists, so on. That's obvious. But frankly, paid news is so much a part of the corporate takeover of the whole world, frankly, that, you just have to be so clear and rooted in young people and people who get their news from, watching interpretations on TV channels. You cannot imagine what it was during the Lok Sabha elections in India. I mean, nobody had a chance because there was a corporate support, a united, strong corporate backing of Mr. Modi as Prime Minister. And the main media channels in India were totally with it. So you saw live wall-to-wall coverage of every statement he made, every speech he made. It was just the most amazing take. They said, oh, well, this is like the American presidential elections. And I said, well, God help India.
So, I mean, and that's what Chomsky called manufacturing consent.
Yeah, absolutely, years ago. And, and we're seeing it now in so many diverse ways. And I think that is really, if they are allowed to take over internet, which is really a big struggle which is going on right now, you deep pockets and independent channels don't go together. And I think the very fact that independent channels such as yours exist is also because there is such a need. People feel the need for it more and more. They want less noise and more news.
So finally, I'm wondering if you think the fact that Mr. Modi has made such vast promises to the Indian people, that the good days are coming, that he has made such exuberant pledges that, a year later he's not able to put forward. He may not even have enough votes in the upper house of parliament to push forward some of his reforms. Is there a risk that that exuberance might fade, that people would start, the vast majority of people who might have drunk the Kool-Aid might start to see through it?
As far as Mr. Modi is concerned, it's certainly a concern. As far as we are concerned, that's what we're working for, because what we have seen, and I agree with you that, 1 year is not, you cannot really come, but you can certainly see the direction a government is going to take. And this is really, so pro-corporate and backed by, forces of sectarian strife. You have this whole part of communalization of politics where religion becomes an instrument of really sectarian mobilization targeting minorities. Now, that is the greatest concern for India today. And I think a combination of corporates and the sectarian mobilization based on religion targeting minorities, that is really a very big challenge which has emerged in the last year because you have a prime minister who is openly committed to the RSS view of so-called Hindutva in India. And I think that's not India.
Yeah, and in fact, let's squeeze in one last question on that because it is a big question. The fact that this man himself personally has been implicated in the horrific genocidal communal violence, but also his party has fomented and whipped up religious fervor and Hindu supremacy. He's keeping that or trying to keep that under wraps, or has some of that seeped out in the past year?
Well, you have his members of parliament in his presence making the most outrageously anti-minority, anti-constitutional, provocative statements, and he sat there in silence. His silence has been deafening on this. And this is the two-track politics that you speak something, you say, we're going to take everybody with us. And then at the grassroots level, you are giving full rein and support to the RSS to have direct access to power. And I think that is the story of Mr. Modi's success. You still have the RSS working hard to divide India, and you have a prime minister who believes in that, and he defends that by his silence.
I would love to talk to you again in a couple of years and see where Mr. Modi is headed. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It was a real pleasure, and may I congratulate you on your channel and your own programs.
Thank you so much. Such an honor. Thank you. Brinda Karat is a leading Indian politician with the Communist Party of India, Marxist, and I spoke with her recently about Narendra Modi's first year in office. This is Uprising. Anna Bus is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. And Teddy Robinson and Jonathan Alexander are our audio engineers. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. Subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprisingwithsonali. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.